12 at 6 p.m. on the dot. I would ask that Rachel note roll call, and I would ask Doug to lead us in the recitation of the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, and I see that Jocelyn has joined us on video. We have Carol. Did I see Renee? Okay. Okay, just so when we're asking questions, we can see her hand. I don't have any immediate announcements, unless Alex has something. Then I would ask for a motion to approve the minutes of October 10th and November 14th.
So moved.
We have a motion. Do we have a second? Are there any comments, questions, or edits? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Appearances other than Tom and Jocelyn, okay. So we will take them when we get to that item. That would be now.
Oh, no, we got one small update first and then.
Okay, all right, well then let's take 7.1, section 18, transition update.
So since the last time we met, I did get an email back from the Milwaukee field office saying that their legal team has completed their review of the supplemental documents that we submitted to them, and we should be expecting a final letter of approval here shortly. So with that in mind, we are going to look to schedule the closing date for the sale of the properties to the LLC. It'll likely be late next week. Carol's going to be moving some money around so that we can do that early next week so that we'll have all that wrapped up. Did talk with WIDA as well. They've let us know that the housing assistance payment contracts for residents for the vouchers, they should also all be wrapped up tomorrow. And then we'll get those contracts next week, and Jay and I will have to coordinate signing all new leases that will take effect January 1st. And then I'm sure there'll be a little bit of closeout activities that we'll have to do after we officially close the transaction, but we are finally getting very, very, very close to being complete with this process. So it's, you know, as soon as we cross that threshold, I'll probably just send out an email just to let you all know, but it will be before our next meeting. So good news on that.
And did you get the HUD certification emails that were coming?
Mhm. Yep.
Good. Good. Well, that's exciting. Champagne for the next time if we get the letter.
Yeah, if we get the letter. We've been down this road before.
We have, Jocelyn was short when we first started. Now she's tall. I was young.
Right.
Keith was young.
Oh,
All right. Presentation from Dimension Development on the Housing Tax Credit Program. Come on up.
So as you mentioned, we've got Jocelyn on Zoom here and then Tom Landgraf here in person. Some of you know these two from when you all started way back in the day with this whole Section 18 transition. Some of you are new faces. I don't know which is which, to be perfectly honest. But today we're talking about something a little bit different than Section 18, although obviously related with our development. Wanted to bring them in to explain the Housing Tax Credit Program, which is extremely important for Jay and I as staff to understand and for our finance team to understand, but also very important for all of you to understand. It has a lot of implications for our development and the next building. And so please feel free to ask lots of questions. I'll let Tom and Jocelyn take it from there.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about tax credits, one of my favorite subjects. So hopefully this will not be too far in the weeds, but it'll kind of skip across the top of them so that we get past some of just the basic stuff you hear about, but don't really understand how it all fits together. So the goal is to try to arrange the puzzle pieces so some of it starts to come into focus. Certainly, the goal isn't to have every piece of it straight today, but at least you'll have a good flavor for where the questions would come from, and also how this links to things that you and Alex have been talking about with regard to the development that you're looking at here. So, and then Jocelyn Borchardt is online, coming to us from Minnesota. Jocelyn and I, Jocelyn was a student in one of my classes, which is how I met her. And we've worked on some transactions subsequent to that. So she has her own consulting firm, and we originally started working together on this several years ago. So we've stayed as a partner with DeForest to make sure there was some good continuity through the process. So let's see. Since all of you have kind of different approaches to real estate, some may have been in the trench doing it, and others have just kind of watched from the bleacher seats. What I thought I would do is just kind of lay out a few of the terms and make sure that we're all on the same page as to how things flow through. So Jim Grasskamp, who kind of put real estate on the map here at UW and pretty much everywhere else on the planet, came up with a couple of concepts that really anchor, especially the beginning part of real estate. And one of them he called the front door, back door approach. And when you pull on the noodle, it ultimately, regardless of what type of development is, if it's the Sears Tower or redeveloping property on North Street, it either starts with the front door, which is you have a site and you're trying to figure out what to do with it, or you know what you want to do, your Starbucks or Walgreens or CVS or Subway, and you need a place for your business. So you find a piece of real estate based on what it is you want to do there. So your concept is the front door approach. You know exactly what the pieces of dirt are, and acquiring those and then figuring out what's going to happen there is basically the approach that you're working with. A typical developer, starts with a concept, either front or back door, and then that kind of works its way through. Initially, it literally is back of the envelope as far as some of the big bucks, and then it starts to come into focus. And one of the things that brings it into focus the quickest is the first discussion that developer would have with Alex to say, well, hey, I'm so-and-so, and this is what I do. My favorite development is this, and I've checked out DeForest, and I think this is a great place for me to do some business. So what do you think? And then they have a discussion and figure out what fits into the comp plan and what type of financing support might be available. Try to get real estate done this day and age. You're going to need some sort of gap financing regardless of what it is that you're going to want to build. So there'd be that discussion, the issue of zoning. If it's not properly zoned, what the community's rules are on neighborhood meetings and things like that. So that may or may not keep everything kind of going as the developer thought, or they might be back rethinking a few of their ideas. And typically, that's pretty pretty frequent rethinking, and sometimes there's 2 or 3 or 4 of these iterations. But eventually, they get into running some pro formas. Real estate, cash is key to all of the transactions, so figuring out what the revenue sources are, what the expenses are, what's left over, the net operating income that's used to pay for the debt, and replacement reserves. Those pro formas are pretty straightforward, whether, again, you're doing a medical office building or a Subway restaurant or a multifamily housing. It starts with revenues, vacancy, allowances, extra income, gross potential. You take your expenses out and you get your NOI, and the NOI is what's used for valuing property. So your city assessor looks at the net operating income of commercial real estate, and they use a capitalization rate. They call it the capped NOI approach to valuation. And that ultimately comes up with the value of the property, which is largely a function of the cash flow going through the property. They'll end up with 2 different sorts of financing: the financing needed to build it, and then the financing needed to operate it long-term. Long-term financing has to be committed before the temporary financing or short-term financing comes into play, which is to get it built. So ultimately, money shows up to build it, knowing that when it gets built and it reaches a certain stabilization level, the long-term money steps in, takes out the short-term money, and away you go. And we're talking about predominantly rental real estate. The stabilization period or conversion, as it's called, when it converts from the long-term permanent financing, when the short-term converts to long-term. That's typically a 90% occupancy at whatever the pro forma rents were and expenses for a period of 90 days. So lots of tests get made, and when the rental properties, so when you see some new development going up, that's residential real estate, whether it's market rate or affordable, that's basically what happens. They got to get it built, they got to get it leased, they've got to lease it at the rents they said they were going to lease it at. And then when it runs 90 days, 120 days, it converts. Short-term money goes away, long-term money comes in. All of those features really can be influenced by the village in one way or another to help a development get from point A to point B, to help it attract all of the other pieces of real estate. And you have already made some decisions based on the amount of financing you've committed for purposes of acquiring the property. One of the big things you take off the table by owning the property is the developer doesn't have to do what you're doing right now, which is to figure out how to put the property under contract. So lots of community, I typically work with housing authorities and community development authorities, but the technique you're using here is a popular one and growing in popularity. So instead of having the developer come and badgering you for, I want this and I'd like that and whatever else, you have the ability to turn the table and say, look, we own the land, we'll get it zoned, but this is what we want. You know, so stop talking about this and start talking about this. So when you're in that situation like you're in now and trying to get further into, that is in my personal view, the thing that gives you the most control long-term about what you're going to want to do on that site. So you're starting off in the right direction in my view. Now, I think you're all looking at the same slides I'm looking at, right? Yep. So the numbers aren't quite as small in front of you, but I'm not going to go through all these, but this is an assignment I have in my class, but the two columns of numbers are two real estate developments. The first one is a market rate development, and the second one is a affordable housing development. They both cost the same amount of money. They're both 50-unit developments. $9 million is the cost. The one on the left side has rent of $2,100 a month to make it work. And the one on the right side, the same building, rents for $800 a month to make it work. So first question is, well, how in the world does that happen? If the market rate developer needs $2,100 a month of rent, how can another developer build the exact same building and make it work for $800 a month? And the answer to that question is one of them is affordable housing, the one on the right. That one has tax credits in it. The one on the one on the left is market rate, no tax credits. So the impact of the tax credits drops that rent from $2,100 to $800. Again, the same building. If the market rate building had granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, so does the one on the right. There was no tweaking of cost. It's just the financing that makes those two things work. So the second piece of the puzzle is helping a developer work the financing magic to be able to get done what you'd like done. And you have some ability to influence the financing that the developer will use. So not only are you starting out with the site control, which is a great place to start, but because you are the Village of DeForest and you do have a CDA, you've got the ability to bring some financing tools to the table that only a village and a CDA can bring. And that should get you something in the negotiation process. So I'm not going through all this, but I thought you might be interested in, we're talking about federal tax credits. So the three light blue highlighted items on there are the three federal laws that created the ability for the federal government to either build directly or put money into and have someone else build it and operate it. All the rest of the items on there are all of the other major federal legislation that's impacted housing through the years. Now, Alex was just talking a minute ago about the process that you're going through with the Section 18 conversion of your public housing. And you can see the first highlighted item on my chart, there's 1937. Your housing was called 37 Act housing. So the public housing company or the public housing program that you are about to exit, it's been around since 1937. It was the first public housing or the first the first affordable housing program that had federal support in the country. And when you look at the chart, you see that 37 falls in between the Great Depression and World War II. And the 37 Act housing, when you go back and look at the reason Congress created it, it was supposed to be temporary housing because there were so many folks that hadn't yet got back on their feet from the Great Depression. The federal government stepped in and said, we got to build a lot of housing really quick everywhere. It was supposed to be temporary. Well, you're still operating 1937 Act housing. Now, yours wasn't built in 37, but the public housing program has been around the same way since 1937. And it really doesn't fit how real estate works today, which is one of the reasons HUD is making it easy for Alex and you to kind of step out of public housing. Well, I've been doing this for probably 25 years. It doesn't seem easy to him right now, but it is easier than a lot of other programs, which would be much more complicated to make happen. And way down at the bottom, you see the 1986. That's when the low-income housing tax credit was created. And what Congress basically did is they took all the housing programs that had been created before, which were run by federal agencies, largely people who had never developed housing, but writing the rules on how housing should be developed. And they said, enough of this, we're going to essentially take the federal agency staff out of this, and we're going to transfer it essentially to the private sector. And the way we're going to transfer it is we're going to make an incentive for the private sector to put their money in where the taxpayer had been putting their money in up to that point in time. So what was the incentive to get private companies to put money into affordable housing? The creation of a tax credit for purposes of doing affordable housing. The bulk of the buyers of tax credits in the country have nothing to do with housing. Verizon, American Express, most of the insurance companies you see advertising on TV, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. So what would Verizon be interested in low-income housing tax credits in DeForest? You really don't care about DeForest, and low-income housing tax credits is the vehicle. They want the benefit of the tax credit to show up on Verizon's balance sheet. So they have to buy the tax credits from whoever has them so that they can make those tax credits work for their benefit. So that's fundamentally what is happening here. And just to kind of put that into context, the total development costs we talked about before, land, soft costs, hard costs, the existing building. Not all of these costs are eligible for tax credits, but the ones that are create what's called the eligible basis. That's translated into a stream of tax credits that I'll use Verizon as an example. They would get 1/10 of those tax credits each year for 10 years. They would get those tax credits from somebody who has them, the DeForest CDA, and they would pay the DeForest CDA for those tax credits. Because you want all the money up front to build the housing, but they get the tax credits over 10 years, there's a discount. So if you sell them $1 of tax credits, you don't get $1 for it. You'll get something less because they have the time value of money. They gave you $1, you're ultimately going to give them $1, but it's going to take 10 years to do that. So that's the discount. So the tax credits pay for a decent chunk of a real estate development. And the yellow box right here is what was responsible for taking the $2,100 rent down to $800. There's still money that isn't covered by tax credits, and on my chart, that's the gray box there, and that's the gap financing. That could be TIF. It's debt financing that the developer would get from a bank. There are 3 different types of tax credits. You have a scope application in right now for the 9% tax credit. You can see that it generates the most amount of equity. It has the least amount of debt. The way to read this chart is the more red, the more risk. If you have a single family home and you borrowed 95% on the mortgage and you have any problem with your cash flow and can't pay that mortgage payment, you're going to run into some problem with the bank. If you have 80% equity and 20% debt, you have a small mortgage payment. So a blip in your personal financials might not translate into a call to the bank saying, hey, we need to talk. Here's the pricing of tax credits since it started in 1986. You can see the impact of the Great Recession right here. And it's kind of crawled back up out of that, and it's gradually starting to drift down. Pricing of tax credits is in the mid 80s to low 80s right now. That's negotiable between the CDA, if it gets tax credits, and whoever your tax credit buyer is. If you sold tax credits to a tax credit buyer for the same price that another developer did, that's coincidental. That's not governed by any federal rule or regulation. You could sell your credits for 50 cents or you could sell them for $1.50. It's a function of who the developer is. This is the last big slide, and then I'll stop rambling. What's really important, if I go back to the equity here, all the yellow is considered equity in the property. If I was a real estate developer and I was going to talk to you as high net worth individuals and say, I'm going to build this development into Forest, I don't have enough of my own money, I'd like some of yours. You'd come in as my equity partners. I would pay you rent for your money, and at some point I'd give you your money back. There's no free lunch. You're not going to let me use $500,000 of your dollars and only get $500,000 back maybe in 5 years. That wouldn't work. What's interesting about that chart is tax credit equity, you would not have to give back. And when you have the tax credit equity, you don't pay rent on it. So it's called equity, but it's not like the equity you would loan a developer or equity you'd use. And that's what makes it really something to go after, because it effectively turns into a grant at the end of the tax credit compliance period, which is 15 years. So
Explain that, Tom.
it's worth crawling through the broken glass for that. So.
Can you explain that a little bit more? How it turns into a grant-like?
Yeah, let's take Verizon. They're going to buy $1 worth of tax credits from you, and they're going to pay you 90 cents for it. What does Verizon do with the piece of paper you sell them for 90 cents? They staple that to their tax return, and they don't pay $1 in tax. So they don't pay $1 in tax, but for the privilege of not paying $1 in tax, they paid you 90 cents. They get to keep the 10 cents. So that's their return on this investment. They don't need any money from the property that would get built on Main Street. They get it between themselves and their tax return. So you don't have to write them a check every year to rent their money, and at some point you don't have to give it back because they got it back by not paying federal income tax. Yes.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, just for sake of easiness of, let's say $10,000, we borrowed, or they paid $10,000 to us. And that equated to 90% of their tax credit, which would have been what?
Yeah, if
No, that it would have been their tax credit of $1 for
Right.
each dollar, or for each 90 cents.
Right.
So they would have gotten essentially 10 cents worth of taxes for not paying that.
Correct.
Okay.
They got to keep 10 cents that they would have paid to the.
But we got the money up front
Right.
to be able to use for the project.
Yep. You got the 90 cents that they paid you,
Right.
and
Sorry, I said
they
it.
will never pay that buck in tax.
Got it.
So they use that not paying the tax to basically reimburse themselves for the money
Right.
they.
So which taxes are they not paying? Is it federal taxes? So it's not our local taxes that are affected, it's
No,
federal.
it's only their federal income tax. Now, the state of Wisconsin.
Even better.
Yeah, the state of Wisconsin created a state tax credit to match up with a 4%. There's two types of federal credits, 9 and 4. And the 4 isn't worth as much as the 9, surprise, surprise. But to make the 4 federal worth more, the state said, we'll kick in 4 to make it 8. So in that situation, the investor, if it were Verizon, would need Wisconsin income tax So they'd be doing business here, so they'd be
Right.
paying the state of Wisconsin some state tax like we all pay, and then they'd be paying some to the Fed.
Okay.
So they'd have two tax angles there.
So I'm sorry to keep asking questions, but I ask questions. So let's go back to my scenario. They paid 90 cents or let's just say they paid 80 cents for a dollar. Are we able to connect, as long as it's somebody who's doing business in the state of Wisconsin, are we able to combine those two, even at that level, or is it only at those 4% ones?
Well, I'll use, when I turned off Highway 51, I drove past a couple of big companies on my right. They pay state income tax.
Mhm.
They pay federal income
Mhm.
tax. So if they bought the version of tax credits that you could apply to WIDA for, you could go back to them and say, hey, we've got.
We've got this.
we
Would you
have
like
this.
to
You
try
could
to
save
get the
some
state?
State tax and some federal tax.
Okay.
If you went to a company that didn't do business in Wisconsin and you had we'll call it the 4 and 4, they'd say, well, I'll pay you for the federal, but I don't have any state of Wisconsin income. So that's of no value to me. So the fact that the state has a state companion credit really opens up some opportunities. And as Alex and I have talked, and I guess I'm free to tell you what I've pitched him on is you have a tremendous resource here in DeForest. Now, if you drive into the community of Dane, they don't have large employers who could write big checks for tax credits. You do. You have some that are based here, like Evco. You also have Walgreens, which pays a lot of federal income tax nationally. So if Walgreens said, we've got this big center and we've got hundreds of employees that can't live in DeForest and have to drive in all the time, fight the snow, and pay a lot of money for gas, and we don't pay them a lot of money in wages, so maybe they could live in DeForest, that would be a pitch.
So that's one of the ways that we could partner with some of these businesses if they so chose to do so.
Right. And
Nice.
once you apply for the tax credits, who you sell them to is your business. You don't get any permission from the U.S. Treasury to talk to Walgreens about selling them tax credits. And communities do that. U.S. Bank buys a lot of credits, Associated buys credits. It's a function of figuring out, what your marketing plan would be and, suit up and go over and talk to them. And if they say we're not interested, they're going to pay the same amount of income tax to the state and the federal government. You can help them pay a little less, and that ought to get them interested in saying, well, talk to us a little bit more about what's involved here,
So we can suit up and go talk to them, but, there are also brokers and others who do this. So how would we approach that, Alex?
Well, I mean, Tom and Jocelyn could speak probably a little bit better than we could, but if we were to do something like that and go directly, it would save us costs from not having to go to a syndicator to basically create that vehicle for us.
We
But
could have
Tom
quite a
could
few to sell, though. That could be a big,
say that again?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
it's a big
It could be
tax.
a lot of money, yeah.
When I've done that in the past, last time I did it was with the Dane County Housing Authority on some properties that they were working on. Their working bank was Monona State Bank. They've changed their name and I keep spacing out. Yeah. So they were the lead bank. They said, well, yeah, we do business with the Housing Authority. We know them. We'll buy the tax credits because we're paying federal income tax. And in your example, we'll save the 10 or 20 cents on our tax. And the tax credits that the Dane County Housing Authority had were more than Monona Bank wanted to buy. So they brought a couple of other banks in. And so typically, when there's a lead investor that the rest of the community knows, it's easier to get other folks involved. It's housing they drive by every day. You know, they know the village, they know the CDA, so it's not a question of where's DeForest. You know, the tax manager for Walgreens might say, where's DeForest? But, you know, EVCO wouldn't. So in that regard, you have a huge resource. You could choose to not do that and just sell the tax credits to the national syndicators, who will contact you and say, hey, I see you have a list. The federal government requires that everyone who applies for tax credits and receives them through a state allocating agency, and each state has one allocating agency selected by the governor of that state. In Wisconsin, it's WIDA. In Illinois, it's IDA, Illinois Housing Development Authority. So the IDAs and the WIDAs of the country have to publish who they awarded tax credits to. And not just the name of the company, but the person there and their email address and their, you know, and I have my students talk to those people if they're interested in doing affordable housing, because that's an employment opportunity. But the tax credit investor downloads the list, and then they do the dialing for dollars, and they'll call up the CDA and say, hey, you've never met us. We see you got some tax credits from WIDA. Have you figured out who you're going to sell them to yet? And Alex would say, well, no, I'll send you our stuff and you give me your bid. Maybe it's 82 cents, you know, and the next person is 83 and a half. But they've got some deal terms you don't like. So you get to negotiate that. So.
First, you gotta get the credits, which we did submit an application, which we can talk about a little bit more as we go here. Maybe we could kind of get into the pieces about how this relates to our project a little bit too on some of the slides.
Here's another chart you can study at your leisure, but this is this is to give you a picture of what happens to the rent that somebody pays. So just to make the math on the chart easy, let's assume you know somebody who's renting an apartment in DeForest and they're paying $1,000 a month for that apartment. What does the landlord do with the $1,000? And the slices of the pie chart tell you that. On the left side, you can see that roughly half of that $1,000 or $500 goes off to the bank for the first mortgage on the property. There's some property taxes which come to you. That's the gold slice. And depending upon what you're doing with perhaps TIF, that could impact how that gold slice hits that development. The gray slice is money the developer would set aside for repairing the property, keeping it looking good. And then the orange piece is all the operating costs. Now, if you look to the right, the yellow and gray and orange are the same percentage. But what changes is the blue, the light blue piece now has two blue pieces, a darker and a lighter. The darker is the impact of the tax credits. So it reduces the first mortgage and reduces the rent. Your public housing has very low rent. Lowest rent probably of any similar housing in DeForest. Well, why is that? Well, when the federal government created the Public Housing Act of 1937, they said, we're going to put 100% of the money in. There will be no mortgage on public housing. Well, if it's $1,000 a month apartment and there's no mortgage, that's $500 a month rent. So you have been in that situation where you never had a mortgage on the property, but you also couldn't put a mortgage on the property to improve it. And that was the big dilemma that HUD had nationally. stopped putting dollars in to fix up public housing, it started to not be so hot. And they were stuck with the federal law that said you can't put any debt on it. So they came up with a program to say to folks like yourself, hey, other than an act of God at Congress to start putting more money into public housing, we'll give you a quick way to get out of public housing. That's what Alex is going through right now. So they created a high-speed ramp off the public housing interstate for, again, you wouldn't think it was high speed, but in HUD terms, it's fast. So you will be out, and that'll be in your rearview mirror. You'll still have the real estate, and then you will be able to capitalize the real estate, assuming you keep it, in a typical way that real estate would be capitalized. It would have mortgage, it would have some equity. Your plan is to not do that, but to build new and then ultimately sell what you got. So the last thing I wanted to just mention, the federal law has some provisions in that aren't used that often. And part of the reason you don't hear about them is they're only available to public housing authorities or CDAs. And that provision allows you to go to WIDA and ask them for an allocation of what are referred to as mortgage revenue bonds. You can talk to your finance people, but there's an industrial revenue bond which does water, sewage treatment. It's a way to use for communities to issue debt securities that are not taxable in the state or the federal. So somebody who gets interest on those securities pays no state income tax on the interest and no federal income tax. They're called double tax exempt bonds. There's a subset of those bonds that have tax credits attached to them. So if an authorized issuer issues those bonds, like magic, the tax credits appear. It's what we call the automatic tax credit program. They're automatic if you get an allocation of bonds and issue them. Only two issuers other than WIDA can do that. WIDA issues most of the bonds, most of the double tax exempt bonds that create the 4% tax credit. Occasionally, housing authorities will go to WIDA and say, hey, we want to do this ourselves. Give us an allocation of bonds. And then you would issue the bonds. You issue municipal bonds now in the public market. These bonds could be in the public market, but they typically are not. They're privately negotiated sales. And in Wisconsin, US Bank buys a lot of them. So you could take another avenue and not go through the WIDA process and the application process and the timing, and maybe you get tax credits and maybe you don't. You could make it more certain by taking the other route that only you can take, and that is to go to WIDA and say, hey, we want an allocation of these mortgage revenue bonds, and we're going to issue them. And when we do it properly, then the tax credits will appear. So you'll have the tax credits. And then when a developer comes knocking on your door saying, hey, I see you own some real estate, and I'm looking at your advertisement, I see you also have an allocation of tax credits that I can get from you. I don't have to go to WIDA to apply for them. Once again, gives you more leverage. Sounds like a boatload more work. It's more complicated than just going to WIDA, but when you go to WIDA, you're standing in line with a lot of other people. When you get the allocation of bonds, you're the one creating the line that people will want to step into. And if you're not going to want to talk to a private developer, then your CDA will just use the bonds.
Tom, what would be the incentive for WIDA to allocate directly to us?
There really is no incentive. They have to allocate if you ask them. They do control how much. So for instance, the city of Milwaukee can't waltz in and say, give us $250 million worth of the MRBs. So they limit how much you can get, and then they charge you a fee. And so they essentially make their money off of that fee, the same money they would make if you went to them and said, you issue the bonds and we'll pay you interest on those bonds. And part of the interest we pay is their spread, just like a bank who loans you money. They get it at 4%, they loan it to you at 6%, they make 2%. WIDA would charge you not 2%, but a piece of that. But when you do the math, it's typically cheaper, depending upon how many dollars you're going to want to issue. But what it does, excuse me, is allow you to control the process. So it's not a matter of Alex having to apply for credits and we hope he gets them when you're in the process of acquiring property and potentially going through a condemnation to ultimately own it. You would like, or not if, but when that process is successful and you have title to the property, you don't want to have to be waiting for the next year tax cycle to come around with WIDA, because it's an annual cycle. So it's kind of like landing on the moon. You know, you can take that piece out of it if you can get your hands on a piece of credits to think about. And there are, I've worked with a couple of housing authorities that have done that. They have applied for an allocation and an allocation of bonds. They've issued the bonds. They got the credits. Now you have to work with WIDA because WIDA ultimately has to sign off with the Department of Treasury and the IRS to say, yeah, DeForest came and asked us for some MRBs. We gave them the MRBs. We looked over their shoulder and they've done it right. So whoever they sold the tax credits to, EVCO, I'll just pick on them. They're good tax credits for EVCO. So EVCO is going to want to know that the IRS is going to sign off, and the IRS will sign off if WIDA signs off. So it's a, it's a group think in that process. Yes, ma'am.
First off, this is fascinating. I like getting into the weeds sometimes. So this has been really, really educational for me. So I'm seeing here the 2 ways to obtain the 4% automatic tax credit. Does that mean you're limited to only 4? I'm trying to figure out what that means compared to the amount that we would potentially be looking to get.
Good question. A development costs $10 million. The 9% credit, in theory, should pay for about 70% of the 10 million. So 77 million of tax credit equity, 3 million of other stuff. TIF, first mortgage, grants, makes up the 10. The 4% credit pays for about 35%.
Okay.
So that means there's more mortgage.
Okay, so in that situation, and that's when you asked to just have them given to us.
Right.
Without having to wait in line. That basically puts a cap on how much, you can't then go back and say, hey, wait in line for more, or can you?
Tax credits are allocated per project. So if you had 2 or 3 projects, you can make 2 or 3 applications.
Well, what I meant was on the same project.
Oh, no,
Okay, so we're either going to do it that way, or we're going to wait in line for the potentially 9%.
So let's go back to the 10 million. I'll take you into the weeds just a tad. So you're going to go for the 4% bonds. So the developer is going to have to, or if the CDA is the developer, they're going to have to come up with 60,
63, 64.
yeah, 65% of the transaction and 35% will be the bonds, the 4% tax credits. Another thing that only you can do that a private developer can't is you could go to the Commissioner of Public Lands and, as a village, borrow money. And you probably have for various purposes. The Bureau Commissioner of Public Lands is, and let's take today's mortgage climate right now. If developer goes to WIDA and gets tax credits from WIDA, WIDA will put the money in the deal. And those are 35-year bonds with an 18-year fixed rate term and a prepayment penalty that'll take your breath away. So if you do it today at 6%, you're stuck with 6% for 18 years. The Bureau Commissioner, the Commissioner of Public Lands has no prepayment penalty. So you could borrow today at 6%, and if rates drop to 5% next year, you trade in the 6 for 5. And if the theory of what we all are going to hope is happening, that interest rates are going to gradually ramp down, you could ramp the mortgage on your property down until you got to the point where money was cheap, and then you would go perhaps to a private bank and say, we're going to refinance this, and now we want money from Bank A, and you pay off the Commissioner of Public Lands. There's no application fee for it. It requires a motion of the village, and only a city, county, town, or village can borrow money from the Commissioner of Public Lands. Their security is that if you borrow money from them and don't pay it back, they take it out of your shared revenue payment.
Oh, lovely.
So they're basically saying, hey, if the village wants to borrow money and they understand this project, we're good with that. Yeah, you pay them twice a year instead of monthly. I mean, it's about as easy as you can get. And typically, when I have worked with housing authorities or CDAs, and their local taxing entity has gone to the BCPL for money, it has been for their housing authority. So you could do this and loan it to a private developer, but that creates a whole nother issue of what happens if the private developer isn't paying, you're stuck. And then that's a whole nother world there. It's a different situation with the CDA that you appoint board members to, and you basically watch them breathe. So there won't be any surprises in the process. But it does create, I mean, when you marry the BCPL up with being able to go to WIDA, you could put your arms around 100% of what's needed to drag a real estate deal across the finish line.
And the only way that it would affect the shared revenue is if you don't pay.
Right. And if you're building affordable housing that would rent for $2,100 and you're renting it for $800, there's going to be a line around the block all day long of people who are going to want to get into that. And especially, again, going back to the employment opportunities you have, you know, I'll take the village of Dane again. You know, if they were going to do this, they'd have to gamble that there'd be enough people who'd want to live in Dane and pay the rent. The gamble you'd be taking is, will there be enough people who want to live in DeForest? And one of the things that's a real driver of that is the Fleet Farms and the Walgreens and the Little Potatoes and everybody who's bringing employers, and they're looking to you to say, where's the housing for our people? So it would be a long-term play. You know, now if Walgreens and Little Potato and Fleet Farm and everybody, 15 years ago from now moves out, but the likelihood of that occurring, I would think, is probably pretty slim. So.
Let me ask, and I know you're fascinated, but I want to see if other people have questions too. And so I want to just ask, I know we have Renee on video, and Carol, feel free to join this discussion. Carol Thompson is our finance director for the village. Doug, other folks, do you have questions or need information? You're my finance scoop guru, so you won't have a lot.
And I know we're kind of pushing an hour or two, so if we could just hit maybe some of the high points to wrap this up, I think that'd be helpful too.
Yeah, Jocelyn is put together a little set of numbers on the application to take you inside the application that the CDA just submitted to WHEDA, so you can see the impact of those tax credits on a development that you've all been talking about. So there's Jocelyn's slide.
I'm so glad we just got the question a second ago about what is the difference between how this project, the actual project in the forest looks like as a 9% deal versus a 4% deal. So that's exactly what we've worked up today for you, 9% versus 4% versus no tax credit, just to see the effect on the project. So these are actual numbers based on that scoping application, pre-application that we submitted last week to WHEDA for a 9% project funding. So we're looking at a total cost here of just under $20 million. That's the most that WHEDA will allow us to spend on this project. It's location-based, it's number of units-based, it's square footage-based. And we figured we're going to build the best project we can. So we started with that max cost number. The breakdown of the different funding sources you can see here along with the percentage. Just going to draw your attention to the arrow there. So 9% tax credit and a little bit of solar tax credits. We'll talk about that real quick in a bit. Account for almost 50% of the project cost here. Tom mentioned a second earlier that 9% deals usually have about 70% of the project cost. Part of the reason it's a little less here is because of WHEDA's scoring model. WHEDA essentially incentivizes you to take less credit than you could support. And if we jump to the next slide, we can look at how those tax credits are calculated. Here you can see you start with this top number, the eligible project cost. You essentially multiply it by this 9% amount to see how much tax credits you generate. You can see here that 1.6 million number is higher than the max scoring number right below it, that 1.17 number. And then the max they'll let you allow regardless of, they'll allow you to take in that 1.2 million number. So what we've done was we've maximized the scoring here and selected that middle number. So just under 1.2 million in annual tax credits. Pricing per unit, we looked at a chart of the different pricing over the years. Here we're assuming 82 cents, which is right at the bottom of WHEDA's assumptions right now. So we're being conservative there. And as you saw with the chart before, that's right in line with what we're looking at right now. That brings you to that 9.6 million in LIHTC equity down at the bottom. You multiply that credit you get every year by 10 to get that final number, that 10-year claiming period that Tom alluded to. The column just to the right of this is a much smaller percentage of the project, but just want to mention it briefly. Right now, we're assuming that the project has a mid-sized solar system on the roof. This is partially generated by the WHEDA scoring, that they're essentially incentivizing it, and you're more likely to receive credits if you include it in your project. There's also some interesting benefits where it brings in additional tax credits into the project in addition to operating savings. They're essentially buying less electricity from the utility because you've created some with the system you've purchased. And so we've we've assumed that those credits come into the project. It's worth 50% of the solar project cost, and we're selling them at that same 82 cents to the same tax credit investor. Those are claimed in 1 year, and so you end up with a total of about 150,000 for the solar, for a grand total of about 9.8 million for the whole project. If we jump to the next slide, we'll just look really briefly at the credit efficiency scoring from WADA, where you can see that to get that max 36 points, which is arguably the most important metric that they're judging projects on right now, is this number. So it would be a poor idea to not maximize this number. But to get that 36 points, you have to be under 19,600 per unit. We've done 19,599. If we jump to the next slide, we take a look at the same project as a 4% LIHTC deal. So this is the one paired with the bonds that we were just discussing. You'll see that 49% of the total tax credit basis goes down to 31%. A change here that you'll see is there's now a red box at the bottom for GAP. What we've done here is we've factored in all of the village funding at the max amount, in addition to the max amount of deferred developer fees that can be supported by the project, because it doesn't have to be paid back. And a second loan from Madison Development Corp that's maxed out. And you end up with essentially a gap between that 19.9 million that it costs to build the project and the number of sources we have. We've got to find this money somewhere. So if you look on that column on the left with a lot of different potential sources of funds. I've left some of these in here that don't have dollars associated with them because they're essentially options. Different places, different rocks we might look under to find additional funding. One big one I'll draw your attention to is the FLHBC AHB. That's the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago Affordable Housing Program. You can ask for up to $2 million per project in that. That would be one we'd look at very seriously for this project. But there's a lot of other ones, especially based on green upgrades, including the solar system. Just wanted to raise it to say that if we do end up going this route, for example, if WADA doesn't award the credit, there's a lot of options to get that $2 million we would need. And next, we would just see the credit calculation for the 4% scenario. So you here that credit percentage number midway down has changed from 9 to 4. You'll see you go from that about 19,000 in credits per unit down to 12,000. That 9 million and change turns into 6 million. So that's the main difference there. Again, just changing the 9 to the 4 is really the math there. The solar doesn't change here, nor does the pricing. The last scenario is saying, let's build the exact same project with the same rents, which you probably wouldn't do, but for the sake of talking about it, we're building the exact same project, and we have no tax credits. And so here you see all that we're including is a little bit of solar tax credits. We're assuming you don't have a tax credit investor and you're using this new direct pay program, so you're able to get actually a little bit more for the solar by going this route. But you don't have the tax credit. So you're down to 1% of the total deal. That means that gap at the bottom has gotten quite big, 7.8 million. So the challenge here, of course, is where do we find 7.8 million? That 2 million is achievable, frankly, based on the available affordable housing soft funding sources in the area. But this project would be eligible for 7.8 million. It's going to be pretty much impossible to achieve, especially after maxing out the village's contribution. So this is just for illustration purposes, but you can see that the tax credits are really what make the project go, but for them, the project couldn't succeed.
Rebecca?
Just very quick, I noticed in, I think all 3 of those scenarios, it didn't have the TIF in there. I was thinking we were going to be using some TIF.
So the way that we drew this up, that amount is you can see where it says DeForest on the screen.
That's where that's at?
Yep.
Okay.
So
okay.
the numbers that are in there are the max numbers that are reflected in the agreement that the CDA executed with the Village of DeForest, which are using tax increment district number 6. So that's the TIF.
So it seems like from this that the 9% is, we're going to just have to stay in line to make this truly cost efficient.
So we are in the line. We submitted a 9% application on December 6th, reflecting, well, I'll go back to the slide here. Reflecting these numbers. And you can see, as Jocelyn was kind of talking about, the capital stack that's involved in this. We would still need to likely go out for a couple of other additional sources to bring funds into the project to build this. So there's still, you know, even if we are awarded a 9%, there's still some work to be done as well.
It's a step though, big step. Did we figure any cost in here for selling existing property?
No. So that is absent that. And again, when we run the pro forma, like Tom was talking about with some of these different development pro formas, and I know it's been a while since we looked at that maddening spreadsheet. With this construction phase loan and some of the loans from the village, we have a payback schedule out of our operations of the facility. Certainly the funds that we would have from divesting of those properties could also go to accelerate that repayment schedule as well. But no, those are not reflected in any of the pro formas that we ran.
So, questions? It's a lot to absorb, Tom. But it's good information, so we appreciate it.
Tom, I just want to tell you, you taught Jocelyn well.
Yeah, and these two have been extremely instrumental in getting us to get that application in and at every phase of this. So thank you both, Tom and Jocelyn, for presenting tonight and for continuing to help us get this across the finish line. Yeah, so I was asking Tom before, just as a quick aside, and maybe Jocelyn, you might even know the answer to this too. So they did publish this afternoon the applications for the 4% and the 9%. And I wasn't sure if that meant those are the ones that move on to the next round, or those are just all the people who submitted. Oh, shucks. Okay. Yep. A reduction. Gotcha. Okay. Got it. Well, thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Thank you.
Stay warm.
6-7 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just
All
a
right.
very quick question. So if the 9%, if for some kicks and giggles here, the devil's advocate, we get denied, then we go for the 4%.
So that's a good question. I think Jocelyn heard it too. So I think the way that WIDA is approaching it this year, and correct me if I'm wrong, either Tom or Jocelyn, is they are reviewing these applications, and if they could choose whether or not we get a 9% or a 4%. Is that correct? They could make that determination. Oh, sorry. Tom, can you come back to the mic? We got a member on Zoom here who can't hear you. My apologies.
So the tax credits come to the state based on population. So every state gets a different amount of credits. And then WIDA puts it in different buckets. And the number of applications in each bucket determine really where the cutoff scores are in the bucket. So if there were very few applications, maybe everybody who applied got them, so the cutoff score would be real low. So there was always a guessing game about where you were going to apply. And the cost of an application was pretty significant. What we submitted with Forrest on Friday in a typical scenario would have probably had $35,000 worth of third-party reports and other things associated with it, maybe even more. What we did this time around was to say we're going to not require those reports. Just give us site control so we know you're really serious. Then you can own this piece of property if we give you credits. And then give us a write-up. Give us the numbers and we'll make a decision. So they're going to go through all those now and say, well, we don't like this idea. We like that one. And they will look at how many applications are in each bucket. And they'll tell 150% of the value of those applications to the applicants. Go ahead and apply. Everybody else goes home. There will still be some competition, but they've made it much easier for people to get in the mix. So that's been I mean, on paper, this sounds like a really good idea. And it was great for you because, you know, other than sleepless nights that Alex had, which you didn't pay him any extra for, you know, we were able to put the app in. So we'll see how it works. And to Alex's last question, WIDA might say, well, there's a lot of people in the 9%. There weren't as many in the 4 and 4. So they might get back to Alex and say, we liked your deal. We're going to put you in the 4 and 4 instead. So that's where you're going to compete against the other people there. So I think what they're going to do is probably try to spread it out a little. So it isn't going to be quite such a food fight.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll just add a couple more things. So what we applied for is a competitive cycle. There's also a 4% non-competitive cycle, which if we don't hit either of these, we could also revisit later in the year as well. It doesn't have a deadline to it.
All right. Thank you. All right. Well, are we ready to move on? Do you need us to do anything with that?
No action. I think, can I just add one last thing to all this?
Maybe.
One of the things that I think is really important and why I wanted to have this discussion at the board too, is that one of the things that Tom said there is after 15 years, that tax credit becomes a grant. And the reason that 15-year is sort of that period, quote unquote, we're obviously not waiting 15 years until, you know, we're not paying on it in that time frame, but there's a compliance period within that 15 years, which we need to make sure that we're in compliance with a number of different requirements. And that's going to fall on our shoulders collectively from a maintenance and administration standpoint on this building, making sure that we're keeping up with income eligibility, those types of things. So there's a component of this that's important for the next 15 years after this is developed to make sure that we're managing the building appropriately. Otherwise, there's a potential for those credits to be reclaimed, and we don't want that. So that's my last point.
Thank you. All right, let's move on then so we can get out in the cold again. The item 7.3, resolution authorizing a chairperson and executive director to exercise an option to purchase 424 North Main Street.
Move to approve.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, 7.4, discussion and potential action regarding the operating budget for CDA's properties at 509 North Main Street and the Meadow Lane duplexes. All right.
So Jay's gonna run this one.
So I had planned on kind of going through line by line on the, do we have that up, the slide, or is that not, does that not come up? The budget that you guys had in the packet, I don't know if that's something with the time that you guys really want to do. There's a couple of things that we should talk about. First one being on the screen right there, the tenant rent revenue and state WIDA grant are blank, those lines in the 25 budget. The total is known, but until we receive the HAP contracts from WIDA, we are not going to understand what percentage is going to come from residents and what is going to come from WIDA to make up that difference. And the revenue is going to be up by 126%. So, that's 125%. So that's pretty fantastic. There's some new things on the administration line. The accounting went away because we're coming out of the HUD program. We won't need to use any special accountants. We'll just be relying on our finance team. A new line, advertising and marketing, we put in $2,000 to reflect the fact that we're going to need to rent these units on the open market, which remains to be seen how we'll go. I think the Meadow Lane duplexes will be relatively easy. The 509 building might be a little bit more of a challenge. Then some staff and training stuff. Maintenance and operations, materials budget went up significantly. We broke it down in our budget spreadsheet, which is something we hadn't done before. Materials came into like 10,000 of that, and we also broke it down to appliances and maintenance equipment, stuff that has really been showing up as of late as being a problem. Plumbing and repairs was down. Alex went through and did analysis on multiple years and tried to make these numbers, all of the numbers, reflect actual costs instead of just throwing numbers around, which is fantastic. Electrical contracts is up a little bit. We have a couple $1,000s in heat tape that we need to put onto the building, make sure it lasts us for the remainder till we get our new building built. Extermination contracts is up significantly. Now includes an amount for special treatments of those B words that we seem to keep talking about, in addition to our normal pest and rodent control. Snow removal was under budgeted. It didn't account for any non-routine snow removal stuff that is more than 12 snowfalls in excess of 6 inches, or removal of snow because of an excess. Unit turnaround contracts is going to be the big ticket item here. It's $26,500 for the same reasons that I mentioned about having to rent these on the open market. There's going to be a number of units that are going to be probably need some significant work done. The 2 units that are available right now, we're into for the tune of about $7,000 already for just new carpet and painting. So, seems like a big number that's not going to probably go real far, which is okay. With the new vouchers being issued, residents have to stay put for 1 year to be able to take their vouchers with them. So I don't expect that we're gonna have a lot of resident turnaround, except for, of course, somebody passing away or something like that. So general expenses, payment in lieu of taxes is a number that's up significantly. That's a new calculation because we're out of the HUD program. And the insurance numbers are down significantly. Cheers to Alex for shopping a good deal with insurance. And the last item I'd probably like to point out is the replacement reserves. That amount is set in this budget at 20% of gross revenues, without getting capital, improvement subsidy from the government. We are in need of having some types of reserves to do whatever comes up, right? So, put that in there to make sure that we have, an ability to take care of the building for hopefully just the short term here. Which puts us to operating income of just over 32,000, which is a pretty significant upgrade over what it looked like last year. So to the tune of 132%. So I think that we did I didn't do Alex and Carol of the Wizards. I poked in when I could. Learning process for me, which has been really interesting. But yeah, I think it's pretty solid. And then I plan on tracking stuff a lot better than I have known about before. So we'll dial it in over the next couple of years too. So.
You have Carol or Alex, anything to add? So,
Who does your snow removal?
That's Ramish Enterprises has our landscape and snow removal contract.
Is it not the same? There?
It is the same. Yep. Yep. It's tied together.
We're in that contract till 2026. So guys, when we are looking for action on.
if there, any other questions? If not, I would look for a motion to approve.
So moved.
I'll second.
A motion and a second. If there's no other discussion, I would ask all those in favor to signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right. Excuse me.
No
Thank you.
yawning.
I've been getting up to give Steve meds every couple of hours and I'm not sleeping much, so I apologize. Old business, I have none. Reports, Housing Division.
So we do not have financials from Attic Angel for Jefferson Square. They aren't required to get them in per our agreement until the 15th so that they can be reviewed by Carol. We discussed it and thought it appropriate to hold back the public housing statements also for this month so that we are looking at the same months at the same time frame to avoid confusion mostly by me. So we don't have any of the financials to go over. As far as a housing update, Demery told me that Jefferson Square residents really took well to the increase in monthly service fees. She had very little pushback as far as and complaints about it. Most of the residents thought it was fair and justifiable. So I thought that's a huge win. And kudos to Alex for putting that together. He was catalyst in that with the insurance premium savings. I mean, I think we would have had a bigger headache on our hands if that savings wasn't found. I don't think the residents would have probably been as happy. So good job to him. If you look at the wait list, Demery's been working through. I asked her for an update this morning. She never got back to me. Still 2 units unoccupied, 1 under contract. That's 714, expecting a move-in date of February 1st. 720, she's still working on, same old, which obviously isn't fantastic. It's good to know though that other people with marketing experience are having the same struggles that we were having. So it's not something that we were or weren't doing necessarily. I know that it was talked about that, maybe having the unit finished would have, eased this process, and that hasn't seemed to help either. So hopefully their marketing team can get that thing sold too. The public housing waiting list is actually closed. We will open up a new waiting list after the first of the year and maintain that for the new entity. Which is yet to remain nameless here for the building. As I mentioned, 714 is underway. So 720 is underway. Public housing, both 100 Meadow Lane and Unit 132 at the 509 building have both started. The painters actually, the carpet's ripped out. The painters was at Meadow Lane started today. So those are underway. It will be interesting, as I said, to see how and what the feedback is when we get those things in shape to rent. So
What remains the issue with renting or leasing out Jefferson Square right now?
Demery said it's the same. It's a couple of things, I guess. She's mentioned the barn is still a hang up for a lot of people. She's also mentioned somebody else, a couple of people mentioned the size of the patio in the back. They don't have the same, doesn't have the same flow. The patio for that unit, kind of, you go across the sidewalk and it's small back there. And the same people aren't ready. I mean, Alex went through the whole list once. She's going back through it. So I think it's really going to come down to, you know, their marketing team putting it out more places.
Is it a pricing issue?
Potentially. I haven't heard that directly from Demery. But I think that very soon they're going to have to start looking at reducing the
I think
price.
they might have actually dropped it below what we initially listed it for.
That sounds familiar, but I don't have that in front of me,
I don't know
and
that
she
I'm-
didn't give me that in the update, so
Yep.
I wouldn't want to speak
Yep.
necessarily to that.
I know we've mentioned this in the past, but I don't know if anything's ever been actually done related to that barn as far as some type of landscape screening.
Right. Yeah, that's something that we might want to communicate. If next time you talk to Demery, maybe ask her if that could be a pitch, like, hey, we'll kick in for, you know, putting some mature trees back there to sort of screen that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic idea. The problem with the barn itself isn't necessarily the barn, it's the proximity to the unit probably more than the barn itself.
How
I mean,
close is it?
It's literally, I don't know,
Like from here
25
to the
feet from
wall?
25 feet from the corner of the sunroom.
Oh,
I mean, it's
a little
pretty close. So if you were to,
It's probably
some
closer
type of
than that
oh,
one.
it's way closer than that. I would say more like,
halfway, yeah,
maybe
to the.
I would say from me to
Totally.
you probably is more reasonable. And if you were gonna put something up as far as screening or whatever, you're gonna further diminish the size of that yard right there. Not to say that it can't be something we can approach and bring up, but I don't know what that would exactly look like, what that's gonna be. So any type of shrubbery or anything like that you put up is gonna, you know, be that much closer to the unit too, and make it feel more enclosed.
Okay,
So my question is, the financial update will always be a month behind?
For Jefferson Square, well, so when we get, and Carol, I saw just unmuted, so maybe I'll let her talk.
Yeah, let me handle that. Yeah, our thought was it would be confusing if you have, for example, right now, I could have presented November's information for public housing and redevelopment. But then next month I would have had December statements for those two entities, and I would have had November's information for Jefferson Square. So we just thought it would avoid some confusion if we wait now and just give you all of the same month's information at the same time. And since we've given Attic Angel until the 15th of the month to share financial information for Jefferson Square, we'll never have Jefferson Square's information for you right away in the next month. So we just thought it would make more sense to keep them all together at the same time. So yes, we'll always be a month behind again.
I could just say that, so while you'll review those statements, obviously we don't, as a board, we've decided not to take any formal action on those, which is fine. The three of us, we're obviously seeing numbers every day. So if there are things, while we're reviewing a statement, you know, a month or two back, if there's something that we feel needs to be brought up that's in a current level, we can certainly talk about that.
thank you. How about the redevelopment division? Is there any financial update? Anything we need to know?
Nope.
Okay. And the monthly prudential statement is up on the screen.
Yep, it looks a little different this year, and if you recall, when Josh came to present, he mentioned that they were getting bought out by LPL Financial. So this is how the statements look this year. Obviously, we still had since the last statement, we had a unrealized gain that was a nice uptick as well, so.
Questions? If not, there is no communication I'm aware of. We don't have a closed session. And so I would ask if there's any other business to come before the authority. And note that the next meeting is scheduled for January 9th. If not, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We're adjourned at 7:30 PM.
That was an hour and a half.
I think we should
Lots of
make a
questions.
motion.
Really good
Yeah.
presentation.
Timetable.
Yeah.
Table